We're back on the record. This is the beginning of disc number 2 in the continuing deposition of John Pennington. The time is now 11:16 a.m.
Mr. Pennington, back to Exhibit 8. This is that email exchange in January of 2006 that we've been talking about just before the break. Under paragraph 1, it indicates, Mr. Collins indicates, quote, has this slide created additional instabilities at the upper end where further movement would be closest to existing homes? Do you see that statement?
Yes.
And at the top of the page, Steve Thompson responds, quote, Vaughn, you bring up valid points that we should follow up on, end quote. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did anyone communicate to you after you came into the Department of Emergency Management that Mr. Collins had made that statement and Mr. Thompson had concluded, Vaughn, you bring up valid points that we should follow up on?
No, I don't recall that, and I wasn't brought in until July of that year.
Mr. Collins also indicates in paragraph 2, quote, also consider putting targets on the slide which could be monitored to detect long-term slide movement, end quote. And again, at the top of the page, Mr. Thompson says, Vaughn, you bring up valid points that we should follow up on. Did anyone pass on to you that Mr. Collins had made that statement and that Mr. Thompson had responded that they were valid points that should be followed up on?
No, I do not recall that I've seen that.
Okay. Is it fair to say that in your role as the director of the Department of Emergency Management, that this is the type of information you would want to know? Namely, if there was a landslide risk where someone was suggesting that there be a geotechnical study performed, an evaluation of slide run-out distances, do monitoring to detect long-term slide movement, is it fair to say that is the type of information you would want to know?
Yes.
If you had been notified that there was that type of concern regarding the Hazel landslide that occurred in 2006, and that had been brought to your attention, would it be your practice to follow up on the concern to see if it was valid?
Object to the form.
Can you repeat the question?
Would it be your practice to follow up on that type of concern if
Yes.
it had been brought to your attention?
Yes.
Mr. Pennington, handing you what's previously been marked as Exhibit 10. So this is some excerpts from the Stillaguamish River Comprehensive Flood Hazard Management Plan that was adopted by the county on February 18th of 2004. Have you ever seen that plan before?
No.
If, in reference to the Hazel landslide, on the very last page of this document, there was a recommended action number 21. indicating, quote, implement a Steelhead Haven slide stabilization project. And then it goes on to state, implement a stabilization project through the authority of the Corps that meets public safety and environmental restoration goals of this plan. You see that?
Yes.
In your role as Director of Department of Emergency Management over the entire time period that you were there, did anyone bring to your attention that the county had adopted this plan with that recommendation?
No, I do not recall that.
Okay. In your role as Director of the Department of Emergency Management, is that the type of information you would have wanted to know, namely that a recommendation to implement a slide stabilization project at Steelhead Haven had been made and the plan had been adopted?
Yes.
And if you'd received that information, is that the type of information you would follow up on and explore?
Within my capacity, yes.
Mr. Pennington, handing you what has previously been marked as Exhibit 17. It's entitled Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan Update, Volume 1, Planning Area-Wide Elements, September of 2010. Have you seen this document before?
Yes.
Okay. And was this a plan update that was prepared during the period of time that you were Director of the Department of Emergency Management?
Yes.
Okay, and did you have any role or involvement in preparation of the plan?
No, executive guidance of the project manager and of the committees that were established to build the plan.
So if you turn to what is page Roman numeral 13, at the bottom, it has acknowledgments. Do you see that? Is that a yes?
Yes.
And so project manager was Jason Bierman, who you referred to earlier?
Yes, correct.
But it says then other DEM staff, your name is shown there as being involved?
Yes.
Okay. And I take it you reviewed the plan, correct?
I reviewed most of the plan.
And from the Department of Public Works, Steve Thompson was involved, correct?
Yes.
And from Surface Water Management, John Engel was involved, correct?
Yes.
And did you interact with them on preparation of this plan?
No, I did not.
So if you turn to the executive summary, which starts with page ES1, it indicates in the second paragraph, quote, Snohomish County and a partnership of local governments within the county have developed and maintained a hazard mitigation plan to reduce future loss of life and property resulting from disasters. End quote, correct?
Yes.
And was that in fact one of the goals of this 2010 plan, namely to reduce future loss of life and property?
I believe that's, yes.
Okay. And then under the plan update, it talks about, and this is at the very bottom of page ES1, quote, use of best available data to update the risk assessment portion of the plan, end quote. Do you see that?
Yes.
Were you familiar with the concept of LIDAR?
Yes, not technically, but aware of what LIDAR is, yes.
Under your guidance as the Director of the Department of Emergency Management, was LIDAR used in any respect by the department to study landslide hazard risks?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Did you know that the LiDAR tool was available and could be used to study landslide hazard risks?
I was aware that it was primarily being utilized for the purposes of discovering earthquake fault lines.
Okay, but were you aware that LiDAR enabled you to sort of see through the trees and be able to see where landslides had occurred, how they had run out, that type of thing?
No.
If you turn to page ES4, under guiding principle, it says, quote, through partnerships, reduce the vulnerability to natural hazards in order to protect the health, safety, welfare, and economy of the community. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then goal number 1 remained, quote, reduce natural hazard related injury and loss of life, end quote.
Yes.
And you didn't try to change that goal, correct?
No, not from the mitigation standpoint.
Okay. And that remained the goal under the 2010 plan that DEM under your guidance was to carry out, correct?
Yes.
So then if you turn to the next page, ES5, there's a table that shows hazard mitigation plan update objectives. And objective number 10 is to, quote, educate the public on risk from and preparedness for natural hazards and ways to mitigate their impacts. Do you see that?
Yes.
To your knowledge, and well, let me back up. One of the goals that it applies to is goal number 1, which is reduce natural hazard related injury and loss of life. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So what was done by the Department of Emergency Management to educate the public about ways to mitigate the impacts of natural hazards such as landslides?
We hired a public education and outreach coordinator.
Okay. And who was that?
Her name is Dara, D-A-R-A, Salmon, S-A-L-M-O-N, and her specific purpose was public education and outreach.
And when was she hired?
I don't recall the exact date, but I recall it was, I believe prior to the adoption of this plan.
So sometime prior to 2010?
I believe so.
Okay. In terms of her outreach efforts about how to mitigate the impact of natural hazards and educating the public on the risk, do you know whether she did anything to educate the public on the risk of landslides?
I'm not directly familiar. We had a strategic plan that focused on public education and outreach, and her job encompassed all of the hazards throughout the county in public meetings, private meetings, trainings, releases of information.
Do you know whether there were any public training meetings dealing with landslide risks?
I do not know that.
You indicate there was a strategic, what do you call it, plan regarding how to handle that release of information?
No, there was a strategic plan for the Department of Emergency Management. There have been multiple strategic plans, and one of the focal points has been on public education and outreach.
Okay, so when would those plans have been issued? I mean, if we take the time period between 2006 and 2014, describe for me the plans that were adopted by the Department of Emergency Management.
I believe that our first strategic plan was adopted in 2007. Subsequently, I believe 2009, and I want to say in 2-year intervals. I don't recall the exact years, but beginning in 2007, we created the first ever strategic plan for the Department of Emergency Management.
How many updates would there have been between 2007 and 2014?
I believe that as 2015 concluded, we were in the final updating phase of our 4th iteration of our strategic plan.
Okay. What do you recall the strategic plan being regarding landslide risks?
I don't recall the very specifics of it as far as how it was being updated at that point, because it was not finalized when I departed.
Who was updating the plan on landslide risks?
It was incorporated. I'm sorry, can you ask the question again, please?
Who was updating the plan on landslide risks?
Define plan.
The strategic plan that you're referring to.
The strategic plan was focused on the larger strategic goals and objectives of the department, not specific annexes or specific incidents. They would have incorporated public education and outreach as an example for all hazards in the county, including landslide risks.
Okay, but would landslide risks be addressed specifically within that plan?
I don't recall if it is directly referenced in the strategic plan of the department.
Okay. So then if you turn to the next page, it's entitled Action Plan, Countywide Mitigation Initiatives. The bottom of the page is CW5, which is similar to what existed back in 2005, I believe. So it says sponsor and maintain a natural hazard informational website to include the following types of information: hazard-specific information such as warning, private property mitigation, alternatives, important facts on risk and vulnerability. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it's to be done in the short term. Do you see that?
Yes.
Was that ever done?
I believe that this was encompassed through our website and the publishing of this particular plan on the website, as well as any annexes that were specific to certain parts of the plan.
Okay, so at some point in time after 2010, then this is the publishing of any annexes that were part of the plan and placing them on the website?
I don't recall. I recall that we made a point to put the plan more prominently on the website. And it was a large, voluminous plan, and we had to come up with creative technical ways to place it on the website.
Because it was so big?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you turn to the last page of this exhibit, it talks about mitigation alternatives catalog for landslides. Do you see that?
No.
Last page of this exhibit, so the very last page. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And so it's a table 20-4. Do you know who prepared this document that talked about mitigation alternatives?
No. Jason Bierman was my program manager who was coordinating all of this.
Okay. So it talks about ways to reduce landslide risks, one of which, it says, manipulate the hazard by stabilizing the slope, either through dewatering or armoring of the toe. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then it indicates that this is on a government scale to stabilize slopes. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you identify any areas where Snohomish County stabilized landslide slopes?
No, not within my department. No, I do not.
Okay, well, I'm just saying, as director of the Department of Emergency Management, through the end of 2015, are you aware of any incidences where the county pursued mitigation measures to stabilize slopes?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Another way to mitigate a landslide risk listed here is to reduce exposure, and it says on the right-hand side, acquire properties located in high-risk landslide areas, end quote. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did the county do anything to identify properties located in high-risk landslide areas after this plan was adopted in 2010?
I do not know. That would have been a responsibility of the mitigation committee and the steering committee.
Are you aware of any instances where the county acquired properties located in high-risk landslide areas during the period of time that you were the director of the Department of Emergency Management?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
in terms of landslide risks, down at the bottom of the page it says increase preparation or response capability, institute warning system. Do you see that?
Yes.
You described this system that was adopted after 2007 or in 2007 to send out these sort of immediate warnings. Do you know if that was adopted as part of this plan, or is it referring to something else?
This plan was adopted after we instituted a reverse notification system, and we also had siren and siren warning systems that we were in the process of implementing as well.
Talk to me about siren warning. How was that going to work?
The best example would be for Sultan and the Colmback Dam. The city of Sultan has a siren warning system and reverse notification in the event of a breach of Colmback Dam.
Okay. Was there any sort of siren warning system set up relating to the Steelhead Haven community or the Hazel landslide?
No.
Are you aware of whether Steelhead Haven, that community, was ever shown as being a landslide hazard risk under any county plan or other document?
I believe that this plan and then in 2015 both identify it as a high-risk area for landslides.
Okay, but I guess I'm looking at the time period prior to the March 2014 OSA landslide. So when you say this plan identified it as being a high-risk area, my question is, was the Steelhead Haven community itself, not the Hazel landslide across the river, but the community itself, identified as being in a high-risk area?
I don't recall that specific neighborhood.
And when you recall some identification, are you referring to the map prepared by Tetra Tech that showed high-risk areas in the county?
Yes.
So Henning was previously been marked as Exhibit 9. Is this the map you were referring to?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay. And so on this map, can you identify where the Hazel landslide is located?
I believe I can.
Okay, so I'll give you a pen, and on this copy of Exhibit 9, could you circle the area that you believe is identifying the Hazel landslide area and put your initials next to it. Here's a pen for you. We have this marked as the next exhibit.
$8.15.
And he was been marked again as Exhibit 815. The circle you've made is the circle where you believe the Hazel landslide is, correct?
In the general area, yes.
Okay. And the circle apparently is referring to, I'm going to call it a pink dot, but a pink or red dot that appears on the north side of the Stillaguamish River. Is that correct?
It is a bad map production, but yes, that's what it looks like.
Okay. Are you aware of any map that shows a landslide, a landslide hazard area to be on the south side of the Stillaguamish River in that area?
I don't recall that.
Other than what you have already described about observing the crib wall or the log revetment out at Hazel in the fall of 2006, did you have any other role, knowledge, or involvement regarding the log revetment project?
I'm sorry, can I take a minute, please, with counsel?
Really not, unless it's a privileged issue, but
Unless it's something that has to do with privilege, you need to answer this question, and then we can take a break.
Oh, it was referring to this map.
Yeah. Why don't you read back the last question, answer that question, and then we can
Okay,
chat.
sure.
Question, other than what you have already described about observing the crib wall or the log revetment out at Hazel in the fall of 2006, did you have any other role, knowledge, or involvement regarding the log revetment project?
No.
We're going off the record. The time is now 11:42 a.m.
Could you please read the question?
We're back on the record. The time is now 11:44 a.m.
Could you please read the question I asked you to find?
Question, are you aware of any map that shows a landslide hazard area to be on the south side of the Stillaguamish River in that area?
Did you want to clarify your answer to that question?
I do. This map demonstrates a landslide hazard on the south side of the Stillaguamish River. It's in yellow and marked under other landslide potential areas. The red map that you pointed me to was the Department of Natural Resources landslide hazard areas. So it was identified on this map as an area, just a different color.
oh, you're saying essentially that anything yellow on this map is identified as an other landslide potential hazard area, correct?
In answering your question, that it is on the south side of the river. Yes.
Anything in yellow on this map is what is being identified as an other landslide potential area, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, but in terms of the DNR maps, state maps about landslide hazard areas, the area that you have circled regarding the Hazel landslide that is in pink or red, whatever color you want to call it, is on the north side of the river, correct?
Predominantly, yes.
Do you know if it passes anywhere onto the south side of the river?
Again, this is not a very well produced map, but it appears though the red dot is in the river and almost to the other side of the river and maybe into that area.
Okay. In terms of the March 2014 Oso landslide, on behalf of the county, were you responsible in some way, shape, or form to head up the response to that landslide?
Can you define what head up means? Because it's a very technical term in this field.
Head up is?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I don't care if you use head up. What was your role and involvement following the 2014 Oso landslide?
The response coordination for the Department of Emergency Management and response coordination for the county once the Emergency Operations Center was activated per county code and per statute in Washington State.
Okay. Are you aware that various devices were set up to monitor movement of the landslide following the March 22, 2014 slide?
I am aware that there were devices placed in the area, yes.
Did you have any role or involvement in that?
I believe I was consulted at one point or notified, and I cannot recall who it was.
Okay. Did you understand the purpose of those devices, at least in part, was to try to detect movement of the landslide should further movement occur so that workers in the area could be warned and evacuated?
Yes, I recall that, but we may be talking about two different things. I believe I'm talking about referring to something that was further down the line beyond the first 2 weeks or so in response, beyond a 2-week period, I believe, where additional monitoring devices were put in. I don't believe I was completely aware of devices being placed in immediately after the response, or after the slide.
But when the workers were in the area trying to deal with the slide aftermath, was there any warning system, to your knowledge, that was set up to try to provide advance warning of further slide movement that might threaten human life?
I'm not familiar with the details of that.
Okay. If we take the, let's say, the 2 months following the 2014 Oso landslide, describe for me your role and involvement, what your day-to-day activities were in relation to the landslide other than dealing with the press.
In the 2 months, two
Yes.
months after, or 2 months from the date it occurred until 2 months? Can you clarify the question, please?
Yeah, landslide on March 22, 2014. So we have, let's say, April and May after that. So during the end of March, April and May, what was your role and involvement in relation to the Oso landslide?
My role was as the director for the department, coordinating the response, helping to transition the 530 corridor to recovery, seeking federal disaster assistance, establishing the parameters by which federal disaster assistance was going to be coordinated, looking at establishing economic recovery for the community, and in particular, Darrington, and launching off the long-term recovery function of the disaster, transitioning it out into another individual.
Following the March 22, 2014 Oso landslide, to your knowledge, did anyone suggest or raise a concern that more should have been done prior to that landslide to either evaluate the risk, mitigate the risk, or warn or educate the residents about the risk?
Could you read the question back, please, Carolyn?
Question. Following the March 22, 2014 Oso landslide, to your knowledge, did anyone suggest or raise a concern that more should have been done prior to this landslide to either evaluate the risk, mitigate the risk, or warn or educate the residents about the risk?
Object to the form and the breadth. Go ahead, Nance.
I recall dozens of emails and phone calls, messages being left on my phone by individuals from all over the country who had no affiliation and some who had complete affiliation, talking about the landslide, and everything was a complete blur as to people looking at and trying to look in hindsight at what had occurred. And that's not uncommon for any disaster, but it was definitely accentuated for this disaster.
Okay. Let me try to be more specific. Following the March 22, 2014 Oso landslide, did anyone who was an employee of Snohomish County ever raise a concern, to your knowledge, as to whether more should have been done to evaluate the risk, mitigate the risk, or educate or warn residents prior to the slide?
I don't recall it directly, no.
Okay. Did anyone from any government agency, to your knowledge, raise that concern?
I do not recall that either, no.
Okay. Following the 2014 Oso landslide, to your knowledge, did the county take any steps, implement any changes to reduce the likelihood of a similar disaster in the future?
Object to the form.
Can you repeat the question, please?
My question is, after the March 22, 2014 landslide, to your knowledge, did the county take any steps to reduce the likelihood of a future disaster in the future?
Well, my department makes adjustments after every disaster. if we see certain things that need to be adjusted to. And our department made adjustments after OSO, just as they would during the catastrophic floods of 2006. Countywide, I'm not familiar with a county-wide initiative that made adjustments to that effect.
Let me put it to you this way. Your department, Department of Emergency Management, after the March 22, 2014 slide, did your department implement any changes on how it would evaluate landslide risks in the county going forward?
We placed a higher focus, as did I think the entire nation, on the risks of catastrophic landslides, to the degree that this one occurred particularly. So we placed a focus on it at that point, of course. And we made other adjustments as to our response coordination inside the Emergency Operations Center, looking at technology, lessons learned from the activation that was surrounded the response coordination and the support of the first responders out there. So there were numerous things that were adjusted. One of them was examining with a different view the catastrophic nature of landslides like this that had never been seen.
After the March 22, 2014 OSO landslide, did you implement in writing any different procedures than had existed prior in your department regarding how to evaluate or mitigate landslide risks?
I don't recall that specifically.
Okay. Can you think of anything that your department actually did differently in terms of evaluating landslide risks following the OSO landslide?
No, and that still would have most likely remained within the domain of public works and surface water for the initial and technical expertise for that.
Are you aware of anything that the Department of Public Works or Surface Water Management did differently after the March 22, 2014 landslide in evaluating landslide risks in Snohomish County?
No, I'm not familiar with anything.
Okay. Are you aware of anything that your department did differently after the March 22, 2014 landslide in terms of mitigating landslide risks in Snohomish County?
Object to the form, vague.
You know what mitigation is?
Yes, I know what mitigation is.
Okay. Did your department do anything differently after the March 22, 2014 landslide in the manner in which it approached mitigation of landslide risks?
Object to the form.
Go ahead.
Yes.
What did it do differently?
Mitigation became mitigation of landslides and addressing landslides, especially of the catastrophic nature and especially as it related to Snohomish County, were incorporated to a different degree in the 2015 Hazard Mitigation Plan, which was completed and signed by FEMA. There is a natural heightened awareness to landslides in this nation because of what occurred. That was also incorporated into our plan.
I mean, other than heightened awareness, as a practical matter, what difference has that made in Snohomish County in terms of the way landslide hazard mitigation has been addressed?
Landslide hazard or any hazard mitigation in the state of Washington is contingent upon the funding that is contingent upon the disaster, which builds up to 20% of the estimated costs of disasters. The Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan is pulled out, the objectives, the strategies, the targeted goals, and it's funded to a line at which there is no more money. That is the strategy in Washington State for how we mitigate all hazards. So what changed from 2010 forward, and as we developed the new plan, was that there was an obvious heightened awareness of landslide risks, a need for mapping, other things to occur, and if they were placed in this hazard mitigation plan or others, they will be funded according to the mitigation efforts that are currently out there in the state of Washington and other creative funding mechanisms.
Now, let me be real specific. Has mapping of landslide hazards within Snohomish County changed after the 2014 OSO landslide?
It was a direct recommendation of the SR 530 Commission.
I'm not asking about a recommendation. Did it in fact change? Did something start to be done differently in Snohomish County after the March 2014 slide in terms of the way landslides were mapped?
I'm not familiar directly with your question.
Okay. Do you know if anything started to be done differently in Snohomish County after March of 2014 regarding educating or warning residents of landslide risks in the county?
Yes.
Okay, what started to be done differently?
Public education and outreach, which was already being conducted in our department and in coordination with other departments, was more focused on the heightened awareness of landslides in the county after March 22nd, 2014.
Okay, was after the March 22, 2014 landslide occurred, has there been any effort in the county, to your knowledge, while you were still there, to prioritize landslide risks in the county?
There have been intense conversations about landslides that were incorporated into public education and outreach.
Really not my question. I'm asking about prioritization of landslide risks in the county. And did that change? Did something happen after the March 2014 slide on that issue? Is there now some sort of prioritization of landslide risks in Snohomish County that didn't exist prior to March of 2014?
Object to the form.
Outside of my department, I am not familiar with that.
Is there one in your department?
In my department, the focus is on public education and outreach and addressing communities' needs if they reach to us about the needs for landslide risks and hazards, yes.
Anything beyond that in terms of actually prioritizing where the risk is greater?
No, not that I'm aware of specifically.
Okay. And how about in terms of run-out distances of landslides, the potential run-out distance in given locations? Has anything been done within your department to pursue that issue following the March 2014 OSO landslide?
Within my specific department, no, none that I recall.
Okay, and how about outside your department, to your knowledge?
I'm not familiar with other departments outside of mine on this issue.
Okay, I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some. I'm happy to continue. I think I can probably finish during the lunch hour if people want to see if we can get this done and not have to reconvene.
You know, it's noon. I think we'll probably break for lunch. We can do a short break,
All right. What do you want to do? 45 minutes?
45 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
We're going off the record. The time is now 12 p.m.